This podcast is on theory building in social science research. In this module, we'll identify what is called a unit of analysis for variables that we are considering in our research project. We'll also learn to write a conceptual definition of a variable. We will also be able to develop a theoretical argument that identifies a potential causal relationship between two variables, an independent variable that will be causing a dependent variable. We'll also gain practice in writing hypotheses, and we'll be able to explain the difference between a positive and a negative relationship. So where does theory building take place in the research enterprise? After we've written our literature reviews, we then begin to create what are called theoretical expectations, or how we will expect the independent variable to affect the behavior of a dependent variable. We will give our own thoughts about how and why the independent variable should affect the dependent variable in the way that we propose. To build on what we have learned in other podcasts, again, the dependent variable is our outcome of interest. In other words, it's the behavior that we wish to explain. We want to explain why there are variations in the dependent variable. Not just that an independent variable is associated with a dependent variable, but that it has a causal impact on the dependent variable itself. The independent variable is important too, of course, and changes in the independent variable in our theoretical minds will lead to changes in the dependent variable. And here's another example of this. If our dependent variable is civil war, or war that takes place within the contiguous boundaries of a nation-state between warring sides, and our independent variable is something called ethnic fractionalization. The technical definition of this is the probability of any two strangers in a nation-state speaking the same language, because language and linguistic heritage is identified with ethnic heritage as well. So the likelihood of that happening, if it's high, means that there is relative homogeneity, ethnic homogeneity. And if the probability of any two strangers speaking the same language is low, that means there's ethnic heterogeneity. So, the hypothesis here is that as ethnic fractionalization increases, or ethnic fragmentation, or a diverse number of ethnicities exist within the nation-state, as that number increases, a civil war is more likely to occur. We have to keep in mind that theories cannot explain the entire behavior of a dependent variable. They cannot explain the entire world that we're necessarily interested in. In other words, theories are a simplified version of reality. They're what is essential to be able to understand the behavior of a dependent variable. They're not necessarily going to explain everything about a dependent variable. In this line of reasoning, independent variables are thus necessary to understand how a dependent variable behaves, but not sufficient to capture all of the behavior of a social science dependent variable. We focus on one or a small number of independent variables. If we focus on a large number of independent variables, then quickly the explanation spirals and kind of goes out of control, and it's harder for us to account for variation in the dependent variable. Thus, we cannot focus on all factors that affect a particular outcome or cause variation in a dependent variable. Our theories are thus what is called probabilistic, or likely occurrences, not deterministic, or they will explain all instances of a dependent variable. Probabilistic means that probably they will explain most of the variation in our dependent variable, but not all of it. And that makes sense because in the social science world, or in the world of human behavior, sometimes people behave randomly, Sometimes they behave in ways that we cannot understand or not explain sufficiently with social science theory. Thus, theories are probabilistic, not deterministic. Now we've come to the idea of conceptual definitions. So variables have what are called conceptual definitions. So what does this mean? Well, we'll break it down, first of all, with the word concept as part of conceptual. It's the idea or mental construct that represents some real-world social phenomena. We'll give some examples now. For instance, that people are what we call liberal or conservative, or moderate for that matter, in terms of ideology. So this is a mental construct that we impose on people. It's a way for us to understand why people behave the way that they do on political issues, why they support certain candidates or certain policy perspectives. So it's a mental construct, ideology, that helps us to understand why members of Congress vote for a certain piece of legislation, or why people sign petitions for initiatives to be put forward in a state legislature. Another example would be a system of government, democracies and dictatorships. Again, democracy is a mental construct. It doesn't exist in a tangible way in the physical world, like a physical object does. Democracy, instead, is a way to describe a system of government where elected officials are accountable to the voters and are selected through a free and fair voting process. That is a very basic definition of democracy. Dictatorship would be where the ruling government has complete authority over the population with no accountability and can make decisions based on whim or desire, as opposed to what the people desire. Again, that is an idea about how people organize what is called government. International outcomes between wars, war and peace, also fits this notion of conceptual definition. So war describes a type of behavior, a fighting behavior, that intends to capture territory or money, or both, over an opposing side. And peace is the absence of war. So these are conceptual definitions or concepts that we put forth of variables. So how do we define concepts in political science research? Here are basic steps that we take along the way. The first step is that we have to identify our unit of analysis. We have to identify what it is that we are studying, in other words. Then we have to put values on what it is that we're studying, values of this particular variable, and we have to give meaning to those values. So the steps, unit of analysis, values of the variable, and a meaning for those values all go into this conceptual definition of variables that we will use in our research project. So let's delve a little bit deeper. Unit of analysis. Essentially, who or what is it that we're studying? And when are we focusing our studies? So we answer a couple of questions here. Who, what, and when. There are different levels that can describe the unit of analysis. We can talk about the macro level, where multiple people are aggregated together and treated as one entity. Or we can study at the micro level, or study individuals themselves. And so a good example of that is through survey research, where we study individual respondents. Here are other examples. So on the macro level, countries, aggregates of people from various regions, municipalities, states, so subnational units. The country is an aggregation of all of those. Legislatures, an aggregation of elected officials, elected from constituencies of some sort, and represent these constituencies. Political parties exist at the macro level, or groupings of like-minded individuals in terms of support for a certain set of policies, or a certain value system, or both. U.S. states exist at the macro level. They are aggregates of people who live within a defined space and who are also organized perhaps at the sub-state level, counties or regions or cities or towns. The public's opinion, writ broadly, is at the macro level. So approval of President Biden's performance in office as President of the United States. The public's opinion of President Biden's performance is at this macro level. So it's an aggregation of people's personal views. And thus we can talk about national public opinion in the United States of President Biden's performance. At the micro level, again, this is a good way to think of macro versus micro. Macro is aggregation. Micro is distillation, or the individuals or some smaller unit that we're studying. So we can study individual presidents. We can study the Biden administration, the Trump administration, the Obama administration, and so on and so forth. Or we can compare presidents. We can compare Republican presidents and Democratic presidents. Individual legislators, so we can focus on the Speaker of the House chamber, the President of the Senate, legislators from cities. We can focus on individual legislators and study their legislative behavior. Individual party members. We can survey members of the Democratic Party in Idaho, or identifiers of the Democratic Party, to better understand their personal beliefs. Governors are at the individual level. Governor Little. Governors in the American West is an aggregation of the governors of the states that make up the American West. Individual level opinions on a survey. So we can delve deeper into the notion of ideology and try to figure out for each person who responded to our survey what their individual ideological position is. Sometimes it's clear and sometimes it's not. That's another way to express unit of analysis. Now, when we study these units matters too. So our theories could apply, for instance, only during a certain time period. So if we're trying to explain the lack of war, international war, during the Cold War, that's an era of human history that existed from roughly the end of World War II until 1990 with the fall of the Soviet Union. So that is a very specific era in world history. Our theories to try to explain the lack of international war during the Cold War may not work in a post-Cold War world, because we don't have that feature of the Cold War, the rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States and their respective allies. We could have a theory that would explain the outcome of the 1996 US presidential election, which was fought between the Democratic incumbent Bill Clinton, the Republican challenger Bob Dole, and third-party candidate Ross Perot. But would that theory resonate in trying to explain the 2016 election outcome when Donald Trump defeated Hillary Clinton? So the theory for 1996 may not be as applicable in 2016. Our theories may be time-bound, in other words. Again, these steps. The unit of analysis that we're trying to identify, the values of the variable, and what those values actually mean. So we're going to move on to values of variables. Here are some examples. A country is either a democracy or it's not. Non-democracy scores 0, democracy scores 1. The absence of war is peace. So when peace is present in the world, the variable called war scores 0. And if war is occurring, then the war variable scores 1. We could also be interested in education spending, or the government's spending on education. And that would range from 0, or no money at all, to some positive monetary value somewhere. No real defined edge to that particular value. So those are values, possible values of variables in our conceptual definition. These values have to have meaning, though. So a non-democracy, as I suggested earlier, would be absence of free and fair elections. Democracy would have free and fair elections. So that could be a real dividing point in terms of assessing whether or not countries are democratic. According to the Correlates of War project by Singer and Small, peace occurs when there are less than 1,000 soldiers of the country's soldiers or military die. And a war occurs when 1,000 or more of the country's soldiers die. So 1,000 is a real demarcation line, in other words, to define whether or not an international war is happening. Education spending is simply the total amount of public funds spent on K through 12 education in a year. So this is giving meaning to the values that we have measured for our variables, and we've given them a conceptual definition as well. So let's go further with conceptual definitions in terms of education spending. Our unit of analysis could be countries around the world in 2022. The values we would use would be from 0 to some positive value, some positive monetary value. We might want to standardize it if we're looking at countries around the world. Perhaps we'll standardize it by US dollars. So the total amount of public funds spent on K-12 education in a year is the meaning of these values. So unit of analysis, the values themselves, and the meaning of those values all go into a conceptual definition of a variable. Our next part of this podcast, we will focus on writing a theory.